At my brother's wedding, I was seated in the hallway, so I left. What happened next shocked everyone. The sun beat down heavily on St. Mary's Church, an 18th-century historical building that stood imposingly in the center of Boston. Its limestone, walls gleamed with a golden hue under the midday light, while the bells rang announcing the imminent ceremony. It was June 15th, and the day my older brother, Alexander, would unite his life with Olivia, his girlfriend of 5 years. I, Emma Mitchell, 28, graphic designer and the groom's younger sister, was parking my car 3 blocks away from the venue. I had arrived just in time after a 4-hour drive from New York, where I had been living for almost a decade. The emerald, green dress I had chosen for the occasion, after weeks of searching for the perfect one, wrinkled slightly as I hurried toward the church, my heels clicking against the cobblestone path. Family weddings are supposed to be joyous occasions, times of reunion and celebration. But for me, they had always been complicated affairs. My relationship with my family, particularly with my parents, had been strained since I left home at 18 to pursue my dreams in the big city instead of joining the family law firm as expected. Alexander had been the good son, the one who followed the predetermined path, while I had always been the rebel, the disappointment, the one who chose a different life. Yet despite our differences, Alexander and I had maintained a bond. Not as close as in our childhood, but enough that when he called me 3 months ago to announce his engagement and ask me to be part of his wedding, I couldn't refuse. We had grown up sharing secrets, building forts in the backyard, and defending each other against the neighborhood bullies. Those memories still meant something to me. The invitation had come with a personal note from him. It wouldn't be the, "Same without you, Em. Please come." And so, after much deliberation, I had accepted, hoping that perhaps this could be the beginning of a reconciliation with my family. As I approached the church entrance, I could see guests streaming in, dressed in their finest attire. I recognized distant relatives, old family friends, and colleagues of my parents whom I hadn't seen in years. My stomach tightened with anxiety, but I straightened my back and put on the confident smile I had perfected in New York, the one that had helped me navigate client meetings and networking events in a competitive industry. "Emma!" A familiar voice called out. I turned to see my cousin Sophia rushing toward me, her blue dress flowing around her as she moved. With her warm smile and genuine enthusiasm, she had always been one of the few relatives I still felt comfortable around. "You made it!" She embraced me tightly. "I wasn't sure you would come." "Well, it's my brother's wedding," I replied, returning her hug. I couldn't miss it. Sophia linked her arm with mine as we walked into the church. "Fair warning," she whispered. "Aunt Patricia has been asking about your life choices all morning, and your mother has been, well, your mother." I nodded, already anticipating the subtle criticisms and pointed questions that awaited me. Nothing I haven't handled before. The interior of the church was breathtaking. White lilies and roses adorned every pew, and soft, classical music played as guests found their seats. Sophia squeezed my arm before departing to join her husband in one of the front rows. I stood alone for a moment, scanning the room for my assigned seat, assuming it would be near the front, with the rest of the immediate family. A wedding coordinator approached me, clipboard in hand. "Name, please?" she asked with a professional smile. "Emma Mitchell. I'm the groom's sister." She checked her list, and a slight frown creased her forehead. "Ah, Ms. Mitchell. Yes, if you'll follow me." I followed her, expecting to be led to the front rows where I could see my parents already seated, my mother's perfectly coiffed hair, and my father's distinguished gray temples easily recognizable. Instead, the coordinator continued past all the pews and toward a side door. "There must be some mistake," I said, stopping in my tracks. "I'm Alexander's sister." "Yes, I'm aware, Ms. Mitchell," she replied, checking her clipboard again. "Your seating assignment is through here." She opened the door to reveal what was essentially a hallway, a narrow space that connected the main chapel to a small antechamber. A single chair had been placed there, positioned so that I would barely be able to see the altar through the doorway when seated. "This is my seat?" I asked, disbelief coloring my voice. The coordinator nodded, seemingly uncomfortable but unwilling to deviate from her instructions. "These are the seating arrangements I was given by the bride's mother, and approved by Mrs. Mitchell, your mother." The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a mistake or an oversight. This was deliberate. I was being hidden away, like some embarrassing family secret that needed to be acknowledged but not displayed. I was invited only because it would have caused more talk to exclude the groom's only sibling entirely, but they had found a way to minimize my presence. "I see," I said quietly, a familiar numbness spreading through me. The same feeling I had experienced many times during my childhood and teenage years when made to understand I didn't quite fit the Mitchell family image. The coordinator gave me an apologetic look before hurrying away to attend to other guests. I stood alone in the hallway, staring at the solitary chair that seemed to embody every slight, every dismissal I had endured from my family over the years. I thought about Alexander and wondered if he knew about this arrangement. Had he agreed to it, or was this executed behind his back by my mother and future mother-in-law? I wanted to believe he wouldn't have approved of such a blatant insult, but doubt crept in. Perhaps he too had finally decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I had spent too many years building myself up after being torn down by my family's expectations and disappointments. I had created a life I was proud of, developed friendships with people who valued me for who I was, not who they wanted me to be. And in that moment, standing in that lonely hallway with the sounds of happy chatter from the main chapel filtering through, something inside me broke, but also paradoxically, strengthened. I made a decision. I turned and walked back through the door, past the pews now filled with guests, and straight down the center aisle toward the exit. I could feel eyes on me, could hear the whispers starting, but I kept my head high and my steps steady. As I reached the main doors, I heard my mother's sharp voice call my name, but I didn't stop. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors into the sunlight, took a deep breath of the summer air, and kept walking. I wasn't going to sit in a hallway at my own brother's wedding. I wasn't going to accept being treated as an afterthought, a reluctant inclusion. For once, I would choose my own dignity over the hope of their approval. What I didn't know then was that my simple act of self-respect, walking out of that church, would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only my life, but the lives of everyone in my family. What happened next would indeed shock everyone, myself included. Part 2. The Aftermath. I drove aimlessly through the streets of Boston, my mind replaying what had just happened. The single chair in the hallway, the coordinator's apologetic, "Look, the deliberate exclusion disguised as inclusion." Each recollection stoked the fire of indignation burning inside me. After about an hour of driving with no destination, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of the Harbor View, an upscale hotel overlooking the water. I had booked a room here for the night, planning to attend the reception after the ceremony and drive back to New York the following day. Now, those plans had changed, but I still needed a place to collect myself before the long drive home. The hotel lobby was elegant and soothing, with soft music playing and the distant sound of waves from the open terrace doors. I checked in, grateful that my room was ready despite my early arrival, and made my way to the 12th floor. Once inside my room, I kicked off my heels and sank onto the edge of the king-sized bed. The adrenaline that had carried me out of the church was beginning to wane, leaving behind a hollow ache in my chest. I reached for my phone, which had been silenced for the ceremony, and found it flooded with notifications. 12 missed calls from my mother, 5 from my father, 3 from Sophia. Multiple text messages ranging from my mother's How dare you embarrass us like this? To Sophia's concerned, are you okay? Where are you? And then there was one from Alexander, sent just minutes ago. Emma, what happened? Please call me. I stared at his message, torn between the desire to explain myself and the fatigue of always having to justify my feelings to my family. Before I could decide, my phone rang in my hand. Alexander's name flashed on the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but then I remembered the note he had sent with the invitation. It wouldn't be the same without you, Em. Whatever had happened with the seating arrangement, I owed him the chance to explain. After all, it was his wedding day. Hello, I answered, my voice steadier than I felt. Emma, where are you? Alexander's voice was a mixture of concern and confusion. In the background, I could hear the murmur of conversations, suggesting he had stepped away from his guests to make the call. I'm at the hotel, I replied. I couldn't stay, Alex. I'm sorry. What do you mean you couldn't stay? The ceremony is about to begin. Mom said you just walked out without a word. I laughed, a short, bitter sound. Did she tell you where they seated me? What? No. I've been in the back room with the groomsmen. What are you talking about? They put a chair for me in the hallway, Alex. Not with the family, not even in the main chapel. In the hallway, like I was some disgrace they needed to hide. There was a long pause on the other end. When Alexander spoke again, his voice had lost its confusion and was now tinged with anger. That's not possible. I specifically discussed the seating with Mom and Olivia's mother last week. You were supposed to be in the front row with the family. Well, someone changed those plans, I said, and I don't think it was a mix-up. The coordinator knew exactly who I was. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost see Alexander running his hand through his hair, a gesture he had when stressed since childhood. Emma, I had no idea. I would never have allowed that. I want to believe you, I said softly. You should believe me, he insisted. Look, can you come back? I'll fix this right now. You'll sit where you belong in the front with the family. I closed my eyes, suddenly exhausted by the familiar pattern, the hurt, the tentative reach for reconciliation, the hope that this time would be different. It's not just about the seating, Alex. It's about what it represents. I've spent my entire adult life trying to earn their respect, or at least their acceptance. I'm done trying. Emma, please. It's my wedding day. The plea in his voice tugged at my heart, but I had made my decision. I know, and I'm truly sorry that this happened today of all days. I wanted to be there for you, Alex. I really did. But I can't sit in that church pretending everything is fine when it's so clearly not. So you're just leaving? Just like that? I've been positioned as an outsider in this family for years, Alex. Today was just the physical manifestation of it. I paused, gathering my courage. I think it's best if I go back to New York tonight. Please give Olivia my congratulations. I really do wish you both all the happiness in the world. Emma, wait! Goodbye, Alex, I said, and ended the call. Almost immediately, my phone began ringing again. This time, it was my mother. I silenced it and placed it on the bedside table, then walked to the window overlooking the harbor. Boats dotted the blue water, their white sails billowing in the breeze. Life continuing as normal, while mine felt like it was fracturing along fault lines that had been there all along. I changed out of my emerald dress into jeans and a comfortable sweater, packed my overnight bag, and prepared to check out. As I was gathering my things, a knock sounded at my door. Surprised, I approached cautiously and peered through the peephole. Sophia stood in the hallway, still in her blue bridesmaid dress, her expression worried. I opened the door. How did you find me? Process of elimination, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. This is the hotel mentioned in the wedding information packet, and I know you, Emma. You're practical. You wouldn't have gone far. She looked me over, noting my changed clothes and the packed bag on the bed. You're leaving? There's no reason for me to stay, I replied, closing the door. Sophia sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing her dress. You caused quite a scene, you know. Aunt Catherine nearly had a conniption when you walked out. Good, I said, though without much conviction. As much as my mother infuriated me, I took no pleasure in causing a disruption at Alexander's wedding. Alex is furious, Sophia continued. Not at you, at your mom and Olivia's mother. He found out about the seating and, well, I've never seen him like that. He demanded to know whose idea it was, right there in front of everyone. I paused in my packing. What happened? Your mother tried to play it off as a last-minute adjustment due to space constraints, but Alex wasn't having it. He said either, you were seated with the family or there wouldn't be a wedding today. My heart constricted. He didn't. Sophia nodded. He did. Olivia was upset at first, thinking he was calling off the wedding, but when she found out what happened, she was on his side. She confronted her own mother about it. I sat down heavily on the chair by the desk, trying to process this information. So what now? The wedding is off? No, it's delayed. Alex sent me to find you while they sort everything out. Sophia reached out and took my hand. He wants you there, Emma. Not out of obligation or to keep up appearances, but because you're his sister and he loves you. Tears welled in my eyes, and this time I didn't fight them. I don't want to cause any more drama. The drama was already there, Sophia said firmly. You just refused to play the role they assigned you. And maybe it's about time someone did. I wiped at my tears, considering my options. Part of me wanted to stick to my decision and leave, to protect myself from further hurt. But another part? The part that remembered building forts with Alexander and the genuine affection in his message with the invitation, wanted to believe that something could change. What if I go back and nothing's different? I asked softly. What if this is just a momentary stand by Alex, and tomorrow we all go back to the same dysfunctional patterns? Sophia squeezed my hand. Then at least you'll know you gave it one more chance, and you'll have shown them all that you won't be sidelined anymore. She stood up and smoothed her dress again. Besides, I've never seen Aunt Catherine so flustered. That alone might be worth returning for. A small smile tugged at my lips despite myself. You always did enjoy a bit of family drama. Only when it's in service of justice, she replied with a wink. So, what do you say? Will you come back with me? I looked at my packed bag, then at my cousin who had always been more like a sister to me than just a relative. I thought about Alexander standing up to our mother on his wedding day, something I had never seen him do before. I'll need to change back into my dress, I said finally. Sophia's face broke into a wide smile. I'll help you. As I slipped back into my emerald dress, I wondered if I was making the right decision. I had walked out to protect my dignity, to make a statement that I wouldn't accept being treated as less than anymore. Was going back undermining that stand? Stop overthinking, Sophia said, reading my expression as she zipped up my dress. This isn't surrender, Emma. It's giving them a chance to do better. I nodded, took a deep breath, and followed her out of the hotel room, uncertain of what awaited me, but determined to face it with the same courage that had carried me out of the church earlier. What I didn't realize was that my walkout had already set changes in motion that would alter the course of not just this day, but the dynamics of our family for years to come. The confrontation that awaited me at the church would be just the beginning. Part 3. The Confrontation. The drive back to St. Mary's Church was tense. Sophia chattered about inconsequential things, the flowers, the weather, a groomsman who had already had too much to drink at the pre-ceremony toast. But I could tell she was nervous. I stared out the window, mentally preparing myself for what was to come. As we pulled up to the church, I noticed that many guests were milling around outside rather than seated inside. Some looked annoyed, checking their watches and fanning themselves in the June heat. Others were clearly gossiping, huddled in small groups with heads bent close together. "They're still sorting things out," Sophia explained as she parked. Alex refused to proceed until everything was fixed to his satisfaction. A lump formed in my throat. "He's delaying his entire wedding for this?" "For you," Sophia corrected. "And for himself too, I think. It's like something finally snapped for him today." We made our way through the crowd of guests, who parted, like the Red Sea as we approached, whispers following in our wake. I kept my head high, channeling the confidence I had cultivated in New York, though inside I felt anything but confident. At the church entrance, we were met by Marcus, Alexander's best friend and best man. His face showed relief when he saw us. "Thank God you're back," he said to me. "Alex is inside with your parents and the Hendersons. It's getting pretty heated." "Where's Olivia?" I asked, concerned about the bride amidst all this family drama. "She's with her bridesmaids. She's actually handling it well. Said she wouldn't want to start her marriage with this kind of disrespect hanging over it." Marcus gave a dry laugh. "Your brother picked a good one." I nodded, genuinely glad to hear that Olivia was supportive. I had only met her a handful of times and didn't know her well, but she had always seemed kind, if somewhat reserved around me. Marcus led us through the church to a small meeting room off the main chapel. As we approached, I could hear raised voices, my father's deep baritone, my mother's sharp defensive tone, and another female voice I assumed belonged to Olivia's mother. Marcus knocked once and opened the door without waiting for a response. The voices fell silent as we entered. The room was tense with barely contained emotion. My father stood by the window, his usual composed demeanor fractured by obvious anger. My mother sat rigidly in a chair, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the flush of indignation on her cheeks. A well-dressed couple I recognized as Olivia's parents stood on the opposite side of the room, looking uncomfortable. And in the center of it all was Alexander, still in his wedding tuxedo, but with the bow tie loosened and his hair disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. His face lit up when he saw me. "Emma," he said, moving toward me immediately. "You came back." Before I could respond, he had enveloped me in a hug, a real one, tight and sincere, not the formal embrace we usually exchanged at family gatherings. I returned it, fighting back tears. "Of course she came back," my mother said, her voice brittle. "Now, can we please proceed with the ceremony? The guests have been waiting for over an hour." Alexander released me, but kept one arm around my shoulders. As he turned to face our mother, "We'll proceed when everything is properly addressed, Mom. Not before." "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Making such a scene over a simple seating arrangement." "It wasn't simple, and you know it," Alexander retorted. "It was deliberately hurtful and disrespectful to my sister." Our father cleared his throat. "Your mother thought it would be best for everyone if Emma was seated discreetly, given her history of causing disruptions at family events." I stiffened. "Disruptions? You mean like having opinions that differ from yours? Or pursuing a career that I love instead of joining the family firm?" "You've always had a flair for the dramatic, Emma," my mother said dismissively. "Like this stunt today, walking out just as the ceremony was about to begin." "That wasn't a stunt," I said, my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. "That was self-respect." "Ladies, please," Olivia's father interjected, looking uncomfortable. "This is supposed to be a joyous occasion." "And it will be," Alexander said firmly. "Once my sister receives the apology she deserves and is given her rightful place in the ceremony." My mother's eyes widened. "Apology? For what? For trying to maintain some semblance of dignity for this family?" "For treating Emma like she's something to be ashamed of," Alexander shot back. "She's my sister, Mom, my only sibling." Did you really think I would be okay with her being hidden away like that? We thought you would understand the necessity of compromise, our father said. Olivia's family has certain expectations about propriety. Don't put this on us, Richard, Olivia's mother interrupted, surprising me. Yes, I expressed concerns about some of Emma's lifestyle choices, but I never suggested she be seated in a hallway. That was Catherine's solution. All eyes turned to my mother, who seemed to shrink slightly under the collective gaze. For a moment, the room was silent save for the distant murmur of restless guests and the faint notes of the organist practicing. Is that true, Mom? Alexander asked, his voice unnervingly quiet. Was this your idea alone? My mother lifted her chin, defiance in every line of her posture. I did what I thought was best for the family, as I've always done. Emma has made it clear time and again that she has no respect for our traditions, our values. Because your traditions and values never had any room for who I actually am, I interjected, unable to remain silent any longer. You wanted to mold me into some perfect Mitchell daughter, and when I couldn't be that, you decided I wasn't worth being seen. That's not true, my mother protested, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first glimmer of recognition that her actions had consequences. It is true, Alexander said, and it ends today. He turned. To me, his expression softening. Emma, I'm sorry. I should have been more attentive to the details of the wedding planning. I should have protected you better. You shouldn't have had to, I said. We're adults. I shouldn't need protection from our own parents. No, you shouldn't, he agreed. But family looks out for each other, and I haven't been doing my part. He looked around the room, his gaze landing on each person in turn. So here's what's going to happen. Emma will be seated in the front row with the family, where she belongs. Mom, Dad, you will both apologize to her, genuinely. And going forward, we're going to work on being a real family, one that accepts and supports each other despite our differences. And if we don't agree to these terms? Our father asked, his lawyer's mind always looking for the negotiation angle. Alexander's expression hardened. Then Olivia and I will get married at the courthouse next week, with just Emma and a few friends present. Gasps echoed around the room. My mother's face paled. You can't mean that. After all the planning, the expense. I do mean it, Alexander said. Olivia and I have already discussed it, and we're in agreement. This day is about celebrating love and family. If we can't do that honestly and inclusively, then what's the point of this whole production? I stared at my brother in amazement. This was a side of him I had rarely seen, standing his ground against our parents, prioritizing what was right over what was expected. It reminded me of the Alexander I had known as a child, before the weight of family expectations had molded him into the compliant son. Our parents exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, my father sighed deeply. We may have been overzealous in our desire for a perfect event. Richard, my mother hissed, but he held up a hand to silence her. No, Catherine, we've gone too far this time. He turned to me, and for the first time in years, I felt like he was really seeing me. Emma, I apologize for the disrespect shown to you today. It was wrong, and it won't happen again. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I had prepared myself for more justifications, more subtle blame shifting, not for what seemed like a genuine apology. All eyes turned to my mother, who sat rigid in her chair, lips pressed into a thin line. The seconds stretched into a painful silence. Mom, Alexander prompted gently. Please. She looked at him, then at me, and something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but changing, like ice beginning the slow process of thaw. May have been too concerned with appearances, she admitted reluctantly. It was not my intention to hurt you, Emma. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was more than I had expected. And in her own way, I knew this was difficult for her. Admitting any kind of mistake went against everything she believed about herself. Thank you, I said simply, deciding to accept what was offered rather than push for more in this moment. Alexander squeezed my shoulder. Good. Now, let's get back to the reason we're all here. I have a wedding to attend. He smiled at me. And my sister has a front row seat to claim. The tension in the room dissipated slightly, replaced by a nervous anticipation of what would come next. As we prepared to rejoin the ceremony, Olivia's mother approached me. I want you to know, she said quietly, that Olivia thinks very highly of you. She admires your independence and creativity. Whatever concerns I expressed were my own, not hers. I nodded, surprised by the olive branch. Thank you for telling me that. As we filed out of the room to retake our positions for the ceremony, Alexander held me back for a moment. Thank you for coming back, he said softly. Thank you for standing up for me, I replied. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. It was long overdue, and Emma, I think this is just the beginning of some big changes for our family. I wasn't sure if I believed that. Years of disappointment had made me cautious. But as I walked with my brother back into the main chapel, where I would now sit in the front row as the ceremony finally began, I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't felt in relation to my family for a very long time: hope. What I didn't know then was how prophetic Alexander's words would prove to be. The confrontation in that small church room was indeed just the beginning, and the changes coming to the Mitchell family would be far more profound and far-reaching than any of us could have imagined. Art Duck Part 4: The Ceremony and Reception. The wedding ceremony proceeded with a strange mix of tension and tenderness. I sat in the front row beside my father, acutely aware of the curious glances from guests who had undoubtedly witnessed or heard about my earlier exit. My mother sat on my father's other side, her posture perfect as always, though I noticed a slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her purse. When Alexander appeared at the altar, his eyes found mine immediately, and he gave me a small, private smile. The music swelled, the doors at the back of the church opened, and Olivia appeared on her father's arm. She was radiant in an elegant, ivory gown, her dark hair swept up in an intricate style adorned with small white flowers. As she passed our pew, her eyes met mine briefly, and to my surprise, she gave me a warm smile and a subtle nod. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity and sincerity. When Alexander and Olivia exchanged vows, their voices clear and unwavering, I found myself genuinely moved. Whatever had happened earlier, this union seemed founded on real love and mutual respect. As they were pronounced husband and wife, I applauded along with everyone else, tears pricking at my eyes. The reception was held at the Westbrook, a historic mansion-turned-event venue overlooking the harbor. By the time I arrived, following the drive from the church, most guests were already mingling in the grand ballroom, cocktails in hand as they awaited the bride and groom's entrance. I stood near the edge of the room, unsure of my place in this gathering despite the resolution at the church. Old insecurities died hard, and I found myself instinctively withdrawing to the periphery, observing rather than participating. "There you are," Sophia said, appearing at my side with 2 glasses of champagne. She handed me one. "I was beginning to think you'd made another dramatic exit." I smiled wryly. "1 per day is my limit." "Well, cheers to that," she said, clinking her glass against mine. "And to surviving a Mitchell family wedding with your dignity intact." We both drank, and I let the bubbles dissolve on my tongue, trying to relax. "It's not over yet," I reminded her. "True, but the worst is behind us. And you have to admit, It was pretty satisfying to see Aunt Catherine forced to back down for once. I shrugged, not sharing her enthusiasm for the confrontation. Despite everything, there was no joy for me in my mother's humiliation. Complicated as our relationship was, she was still my mother, and the fractured state of our family brought me no pleasure. The DJ announced the arrival of the newlyweds, and all attention turned to the entrance where Alexander and Olivia appeared, hand in hand, beaming as they entered to enthusiastic applause. They moved to the center of the dance floor for their first dance, swaying gently to At Last by Etta James. As I watched them, I felt a presence beside me and turned to find my father standing there, looking somewhat uncomfortable in the way he always did at social gatherings despite his professional confidence. "They look happy," he remarked, nodding toward Alexander and Olivia. "They do," I agreed, surprised by his attempt at casual conversation. We stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of years of misunderstanding and distance between us making small talk nearly impossible. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Emma, about what happened earlier." "Dad, we don't have to—" "No, let me say this," he interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "What happened today? It made me realize some things I've been avoiding for too long." I looked at him, really looked at him, and was startled to see vulnerability in his eyes, an emotion I had rarely associated with Richard Mitchell, the formidable attorney and family patriarch. "I've been so focused on maintaining the Mitchell legacy, on appearances and expectations, that I lost sight of what really matters," he continued. "Alexander reminded me of that today." "And what is it that really matters?" I asked, unable to keep a hint of skepticism from my voice. "Family," he said simply. "Not the idea of family, or the image of family, but the actual people. You and Alexander, specifically." He took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology, Emma. A real one, not the hasty concession I made at the church. I've been unfair to you, dismissive of your choices and your path in life. And I'm sorry for that." I stared at him, momentarily speechless. In all my adult years, I couldn't recall my father ever apologizing to me for anything substantive. "Why now?" I managed finally. "What's changed?" He glanced across the room to where my mother was engaged in conversation with some elderly relatives, her social mask firmly in place. "Seeing you walk out today, it was like watching a part of our family break away. And then Alexander's ultimatum." He shook his head. "It made me realize that if we continue on this path, we'll lose both of you. Maybe not physically, but emotionally. And I don't want that." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but an opening, a willingness to consider that change might be possible. "I don't want that either," I admitted quietly. He nodded, seeming relieved. "Your mother, she's more complicated. She has her own reasons for being the way she is, her own disappointments and pressures that shaped her. But I think today was a wake-up call for her too, even if she's not ready to admit it yet." "I'm not holding my breath," I said, then immediately regretted the sharpness of my tone. "But I appreciate you saying all this, Dad. It means a lot." He hesitated, then reached out and squeezed my shoulder briefly. Not quite a hug, but a physical contact that was rare for him. "Enjoy the reception, Emma. You belong here as much as anyone." As he walked away to join my mother, I stood processing what had just happened. The conversation felt significant, a possible turning point, though I was cautious about getting my hopes up too high. The evening progressed with the traditional elements of a wedding reception. Dinner served at elegantly decorated tables, toasts from the best man and maid of honor, the cutting of a towering wedding cake. Throughout it all, I found myself more engaged than I had expected to be. occasionally catching Alexander's eye across the room and sharing small smiles of newfound understanding. As the dancing began in earnest, Olivia made her way to my table, gracefully navigating between guests in her wedding gown. "Emma," she said warmly, taking the empty seat beside me, "I'm so glad you're here." "Congratulations," I replied. "You look beautiful, and the ceremony was lovely." "Thank you." She glanced around to ensure no one was listening too closely, then leaned in. "I want you to know that I had no idea about the seating arrangement. When Alex told me what happened..." She shook her head, genuine dismay on her face. I was horrified. "It's not your fault," I assured her. "Still, it happened at my wedding, to my new sister-in-law." She placed her hand lightly on mine. "I've always hoped that you and I could become friends, Emma. Alex talks about you all the time, your talent, your courage in pursuing your own path. I admire that." Her sincerity caught me off guard. In our previous interactions, Olivia had always been polite, but somewhat reserved, and I had assumed she shared my parents' disapproval of my lifestyle choices. This glimpse of her true feelings was unexpected and touching. "I'd like that," I said honestly. "To be friends, I mean." She smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Good, because I'm going to need an ally in this family. The Mitchells can be rather intense." I laughed, a genuine laugh that felt cleansing after the emotional turbulence of the day. That's one word for it. "Alex and I are moving back to Boston after the honeymoon," she continued. "We've bought a house in Cambridge. I hope you'll visit often." "I'd like that," I said, surprised to find that I meant it. Olivia squeezed my hand once more before standing. "I should get back to making the rounds. But Emma, thank you for coming back today. It meant everything to Alex." As she moved away to greet other guests, I watched her with new appreciation. Perhaps Alexander had indeed found someone who understood the importance of genuine connection over social appearances. The DJ's voice came over the speakers, announcing that it was time for the father-daughter dance. I watched as Olivia's father led her onto the dance floor, their movements graceful and practiced. The song was "What a Wonderful World," and as I listened to Louis Armstrong's gravelly voice, I found myself unexpectedly emotional. Partway through the song, the DJ invited all fathers and daughters to join the dance. I watched as several pairs moved onto the floor, including some of my cousins with my uncles. I remained seated, not expecting anything different from the usual pattern of my relationship with my father. But then, to my absolute shock, my father appeared before me, his hand extended. "Emma," he said, his voice gruff with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "Would you do me the honor?" For a moment, I couldn't respond, too stunned by the gesture. My father and I hadn't danced together since I was a small child standing on his shoes at a family wedding. The formality that had defined our relationship for years didn't include such displays of affection. "Dad, you don't have to." "I want to," he said simply, "if you're willing." I hesitated only a moment longer before placing my hand in his and allowing him to lead me to the dance floor. We joined the other pairs, my father's hand resting lightly on my waist, mine on his shoulder, our other hands clasped together. We moved somewhat awkwardly at first, both of us out of practice with this kind of interaction. "I never was much of a dancer," he admitted with a self-deprecating smile I had rarely seen. "It's okay," I said. "Neither am I." As we moved to the music, finding a rhythm that worked for us, I noticed my mother watching from the edge of the dance floor, her expression unreadable. But for once, I didn't let her reaction dictate my feelings. This moment belonged to my father and me, an unexpected, imperfect attempt at bridging the chasm between us. "I'm proud of you, Emma," my father said suddenly, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I looked up at him, searching his face for signs of insincerity or qualification, but found none. You are? He nodded. I may not have understood your choices, but I've seen what you've made of yourself in New York. Your determination, your success on your own terms. It takes courage to forge your own path. Tears pricked at my eyes, and I blinked rapidly to hold them back. I didn't think you noticed. I noticed, he said. I just didn't know how to say it. The Mitchell way has always been to follow tradition, to stay within the lines. You challenged that, and it frightened me, I think. Frightened you? I couldn't hide my surprise at his admission. He gave a small, rueful smile. What if you were right? What if there was more to life than the narrow path we've always followed? That's a terrifying thought when you've built your entire identity around a certain way of being. The song was drawing to a close, but I barely noticed, too absorbed in this unprecedented moment of honesty with my father. It's never too late to try something new, Dad, I said softly. He nodded, seemingly lost in thought as the final notes of the song faded. Perhaps you're right. As we left the dance floor, Alexander intercepted us, his face alight with something like hope. That was a surprise, he said, looking between us. My father cleared his throat, some of his usual reserve returning. Yes, well, it seemed appropriate for the occasion. He nodded to us both. If you'll excuse me, I should check on your mother. As he walked away, Alexander turned to me with raised eyebrows. Did I just witness a Mitchell miracle? I'm not sure what you witnessed, I replied honestly, but it felt significant. Alexander's expression softened. It was. Trust me, Emma, that was huge for Dad. Before I could respond, the DJ called for the bouquet toss, and Alexander was pulled away by his groomsmen. I watched him go, marveling at the unexpected turns this day had taken. When I had walked out of the church earlier, I could never have anticipated ending the night with a heartfelt conversation with my father and a dance that felt like the first step toward healing. As the reception continued around me, I found myself observing my family with new eyes. The patterns and dynamics I had always taken as fixed and immutable suddenly seemed malleable, capable of change. It was a perspective shift, both exhilarating and terrifying. Later, as the night drew to a close and guests began to depart, I sought out Alexander and Olivia to say goodbye. They were standing near the exit, thanking people for coming, their hands intertwined. I should head back to the hotel, I said, embracing them both. Early flight tomorrow. Alexander held on to me a moment longer than usual. Do you have to leave so soon? I thought maybe we could have brunch before Olivia and I leave for our honeymoon. I have a client meeting on Monday I need to prepare for, I explained. It was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Despite the unexpected positive turns of the day, I still needed space to process everything that had happened. Alexander seemed to understand. Next time, then. And there will be a next time, Emma. Soon. I'd like that, I said, and was surprised to realize I genuinely meant it. As I turned to leave, I found myself face to face with my mother, who had approached silently during our goodbye. Emma, she said, her voice carefully modulated. You're leaving? Yes, I have an early flight. She nodded, a slight frown creasing her forehead. For a moment, I thought she might say something more, perhaps build on the tentative bridge my father had begun to construct. But instead, she simply said, Travel safely. It wasn't much, but coming from Catherine Mitchell, even this small expression of concern felt like a concession. Thank you, I replied. The wedding was beautiful. You did a wonderful job with the planning. A flicker of surprise crossed her face at the compliment, followed by something that almost looked like gratitude. Thank you for coming back, she said, the words clearly difficult for her. It meant a great deal to Alexander. And with that, she moved away to speak with departing guests, her social mask firmly back in place. It wasn't the heartfelt reconciliation part of me had begun to hope for, but it was something. a hint that perhaps even my mother's ironclad convictions could bend, if not break entirely. As I drove back to the hotel, the events of the day replayed in my mind like scenes from a film. My discovery of the hallway chair, the painful decision to leave, Alexander's unexpected stand, my father's dance invitation, Olivia's friendly overture. So much had changed in the span of a few hours, shifting the foundation of relationships I had believed to be set in stone. I didn't know what would come next, whether these changes would last or fade away once the emotion of the day had passed. But for the first time in years, I felt a cautious optimism about my place in the Mitchell family, not as the perpetual outsider, but as someone with the right to be seen, heard, and respected. What I couldn't have known then was that this day was merely the catalyst. The real changes, the truly shocking developments that would transform our family forever, were still to come. On Part 5, The Aftermath and New Beginnings. 3 weeks after Alexander's wedding, I was back in my New York apartment, immersed in work and trying to process everything that had happened in Boston. The confrontation at the church, my father's unexpected apology, the dance we had shared. It all felt somewhat dreamlike now, as if it had happened to someone else or in another life. I had received a few text messages from Alexander during his honeymoon in Italy, mostly photos of ancient ruins and plates of pasta, accompanied by brief notes expressing how much he and Olivia were enjoying themselves. Sophia had called once to rehash the wedding drama, gleefully reporting that the family gossip network was still buzzing about my walkout and Alexander's subsequent stand. But beyond that, there had been no contact from my family, not even from my father, despite our moment of connection on the dance floor. Part of me had expected this. The Mitchell family specialty was pretending difficult emotions and confrontations hadn't occurred, moving forward with a veneer of normalcy until the next inevitable eruption. But another part of me, a hopeful part I thought had been extinguished years ago, had begun to wonder if this time might be different. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was in my home office finalizing designs for an advertising campaign when my phone rang. The screen displayed Dad Mobile, a contact I rarely saw illuminated. I stared at it for a moment, my finger hovering over the screen before answering. "Hello?" "Emma." My father's voice came through, sounding unusually tentative. "Is this a good time to talk?" "Yes," I said, setting aside my stylus and giving him my full attention. "Is everything okay?" There was a pause, then, "I'd like to come see you. In New York. Would that be possible?" The request was so unexpected that for a moment I thought I had misheard him. In the 10 years I had lived in New York, my father had visited exactly twice. Once when I graduated from design school, and once when he had a legal conference in the city and we had met briefly for an awkward dinner. "You want to come to New York? Just to see me?" "Yes," he said simply. "There are some things I'd like to discuss with you, and I think they'd be better addressed in person." My mind raced with possibilities, most of them concerning. Was he ill? Was my mother? Had something happened with Alexander? "Dad, you're worrying me. Is everyone all right?" "Everyone's fine," he assured me quickly. "This isn't about bad news, Emma. It's personal." Personal. Another word rarely associated with Richard Mitchell, who had always kept his emotions as carefully regulated as his prestigious law firm's finances. "Okay," I said, still bewildered. "When were you thinking of coming? Would this weekend be too soon? I could fly in Friday afternoon and stay until Sunday." The immediacy of his request only increased my confusion, but I found myself nodding, then remembering he couldn't see me. "This weekend is fine. You could stay here if you want. I have a guest room." The offer surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise him. Our relationship had never been one of casual visits and shared living spaces. "I wouldn't want to impose," he said, though I detected a note of what might have been pleased surprise in his voice. "It's not an imposition," I said, committing to the idea more fully. It makes more sense than a hotel, and the guest room is just sitting empty. Then thank you, I accept. There was another pause. Emma, I'm looking forward to seeing you. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I found myself equally sincere in my response. I'm looking forward to it too, Dad. After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My father, Richard Mitchell, the embodiment of emotional restraint and adherence to social propriety, had just invited himself to New York for what appeared to be a personal visit, and accepted an offer to stay in my apartment rather than the luxury hotels he preferred. Something had definitely changed. The question was, what? The rest of the week passed in a blur of work and preparation for my father's visit. I cleaned my already tidy apartment, stocked the refrigerator with foods I knew he enjoyed, changed the sheets on the guest bed, and even bought a particular brand of whiskey he favored. All the while, I kept wondering what could be so important that he needed to discuss it in person. Friday arrived, and with it a text message from my father informing me that his plane had landed safely and he was in a taxi headed to my address. I paced my living room, alternating between anticipation and anxiety. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath before opening it. My father stood in the hallway, a small suitcase beside him, dressed more casually than I was accustomed to. Seeing him, khakis and a light blue button-down shirt instead of his usual suit and tie. He looked both familiar and strange, like a photograph slightly out of focus. Emma, he said, a small smile lifting the corners of his mouth. It's good to see you. You too, Dad. Come in. I stepped aside to let him enter, then helped him with his suitcase. How was your flight? Uneventful, which is all one can ask for these days. I showed him to the guest room, gave him a brief tour of the apartment, and offered him something to drink. We moved through these ordinary rituals of hospitality with an awkwardness born of unfamiliarity with each other's domestic habits. My father had never been to this apartment, my home for the past 3 years, and his presence in my personal space felt surreal. We settled in the living room, my father with a glass of the whiskey I had bought, me with a glass of red wine, both of us perched somewhat stiffly on opposite ends of my comfortable gray sofa. Your place is lovely, he remarked, glancing around at the bright open space with its large windows and eclectic mix of modern and vintage furniture. It suits you. Thank you, I said, surprised by the compliment. I've made it my own. He nodded, taking a sip of his whiskey before setting the glass down carefully on a coaster. Emma, I'm sure you're wondering why I wanted to see you. The thought had crossed my mind, I admitted with a small smile. He inhaled deeply, as if gathering courage. After Alexander's wedding, the events of that day, and particularly our conversation at the reception, I've been doing a lot of thinking. About our family, about the way your mother and I have approached parenting, about the choices we've made and their consequences. I nodded, encouraging him to continue, though I had no idea where this was leading. I've come to some realizations that I wanted to share with you in person. He picked up his glass again, rotating it slowly between his palms. The first is that I've been a distant father to you and Alexander. I prioritized work and social standing over genuine connection with my children, and that was a grievous mistake. The frank admission stunned me into silence. This was not the father I knew, the man who spoke in careful circumlocutions, who avoided direct emotional statements as if they were dangerous territory. The second realization, he continued, is that I've allowed your mother's rigidity to dictate the family dynamics for too long. I justified it as respecting her stronger feelings on family matters, but the truth is, it was easier to acquiesce than to challenge her. Dad, I said gently, where is all this coming from? He looked at me directly, his gaze steady. From seeing you walk out of that church, Emma. From watching Alexander stand up and say he would forfeit the wedding we had spent a small fortune on, rather than allow his sister to be disrespected. From realizing that my children have more courage and integrity than I've demonstrated in decades of adulthood. I swallowed hard, unaccustomed to this level of honesty from him. "There's something else," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "Something I've never told you or Alexander, something I've barely acknowledged to myself over the years." I leaned forward, sensing the importance of what was coming. "When I was in my 20s, before I met your mother, I had different dreams for my life." He gave a small, sad smile. "I wanted to be a professor of literature. I had been accepted to a doctoral program at Columbia." "What?" I couldn't hide my shock. My father, the corporate attorney, a literary scholar? It seemed impossible. "My father, your grandfather, had other ideas," he continued. "The Mitchell men were lawyers, had been for 3 generations. The law firm was a family legacy that I was expected to carry on. When I told him about Columbia, he gave me an ultimatum: follow the Mitchell path or be cut off entirely. Financially, familially, completely." I listened, spellbound, as my father revealed a side of himself I had never known existed. "I chose security over passion," he said simply. "I went to law school, joined the firm, met your mother at a function for young professionals, and embarked on the life that was expected of me. And I told myself it was the right choice, the responsible choice." "But you regretted it," I said softly, seeing the story with clarity. He nodded. "Not all of it. Not the part that led to you and Alexander. But the rest? Yes, I regretted it. And instead of learning from my own experience, instead of ensuring that my children would have the freedom I was denied, I perpetuated the same pattern. I pressured Alexander into law school. I expressed disappointment when you chose design over a practical career. Dad, Please, let me finish," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When you left for New York, when you insisted on following your own path despite our disapproval, part of me was furious. But another part, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, was proud and envious." "Envious?" I repeated, struggling to reconcile this revelation with the stern, conventional father I had known. "You had the courage I lacked," he said simply. "You chose fulfillment over security, authenticity over expectation. And watching you build a successful career doing what you love, it forced me to confront all the choices I never had the courage to make." Tears filled my eyes, not just for myself, but for my father, for the young man with literary dreams who had surrendered to family pressure, for the alternative life he might have led, for the regret he had carried silently all these years. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. He took another deep breath. "Because I'm making changes, Emma. Big ones. I've decided to retire from the firm at the end of the year." "Retire?" This was another shock. My father had always said he would work until they carried him out. That golf and leisurely lunches held no appeal for him. "Yes, and I've enrolled in a master's program in comparative literature at Boston University. Part-time, but still, a start." I stared at him, wondering if this could possibly be my father speaking. This man talking about pursuing decades-old dreams, about choosing fulfillment over convention. "Your mother is—" He hesitated. "She's having difficulty with the decision." I could imagine. Catherine Mitchell's identity was as wrapped up in being the wife of a prestigious attorney as my father's had been in the profession itself. "Is that why you came to New York? To tell me about your retirement?" "Partly," he admitted. "But also because I want to make amends, Emma. I want to build a real relationship with you, one based on mutual respect and genuine understanding, not on expectations and disappointments. I want to know the woman you've become, not keep measuring you against who I thought you should be." The sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability in his expression. It was like meeting a new person, someone who merely resembled the father I had known. And yet, I could see now that this person had always been there, buried beneath layers of expectation and conformity. "I'd like that too," I said softly. We talked for hours that night, truly talked, perhaps for the first time in our lives. He asked about my work, not with polite disinterest as he had in the past, but with genuine curiosity. I showed him my portfolio, explained my creative process, introduced him to the terminology of my profession. He listened intently, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely impressed by what I had accomplished. In turn, he shared more about his secret passion for literature, about the authors who had captivated him in his youth, about the academic papers he had continued to read over the years as a private indulgence. He spoke about his hopes for his retirement, for the courses he would take, for the intellectual community he hoped to join. It was nearly midnight when we finally said goodnight, both emotionally exhausted, but in a way that felt cleansing rather than draining. As I lay in bed afterward, staring at the ceiling, I tried to absorb the magnitude of what had happened. My father, conventional, reserved, emotionally distant Richard Mitchell, had revealed himself to be a man of suppressed passions and regrets, a man finally ready to reclaim parts of himself long sacrificed on the altar of family expectation. And he had come to me, of all people, the family rebel, the disappointment, for understanding. The next day, Saturday, continued the pattern of revelation and reconnection. We had breakfast at a cafe near my apartment, then spent the morning at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where my father displayed a knowledge of and enthusiasm for art history that I had never suspected he possessed. In the afternoon, I showed him my design studio in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, introducing him to colleagues who happened to be working on weekend projects. Their surprise at meeting my father, whom I had rarely mentioned and never in glowing terms, was evident but tactfully contained. Throughout the day, our conversations flowed with increasing ease, the awkwardness of the previous evening giving way to a tentative but growing comfort with this new way of relating to each other. We discovered shared interests we had never known about, similar quirks of personality that genetics had conveyed despite the emotional distance between us. It was during dinner at a small Italian restaurant in my neighborhood that my father broached another significant topic. "I've been thinking about Alexander," he said, twirling pasta on his fork. "About how to be a better father to him as well." "He'd welcome that, I think," I said cautiously. My father nodded. "He seems happy with Olivia. They're good for each other." "They are," I agreed. "She's more independent-minded than I initially gave her credit for." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "She stood with Alexander, against both her mother and your mother at the wedding. That takes a certain courage." "It does." He set down his fork and looked at me directly. "Emma, there's something else I want to discuss with you, something more practical." I raised an eyebrow, waiting. "You know that your mother and I have always maintained a somewhat traditional approach to family financial matters." This was an understatement. My parents' philosophy had been that their children should make their own way in the world, with minimal assistance beyond education. When I had struggled in my early years in New York, taking on freelance work while waiting tables to make ends meet, they had offered no help beyond occasional unsolicited advice to find a more stable career. I've come to see that this approach, like many of our parenting choices, was flawed, my father continued. You and Alexander are adults, capable of making your own financial decisions. And I'd like to make some amends in this area as well. What do you mean? I asked, unsure where this was going. I've set up trust funds for both you and Alexander, he said. Equal amounts. Not contingent on any particular life choices or career paths. Simply yours to use as you see fit. I stared at him, processing this information. Trust funds? But you always said... I said a lot of things, Emma. many of which I no longer believe. He smiled ruefully. The trusts aren't enormous. I'm not talking about quit-your-job money, but they're substantial. Enough to provide security, opportunity, freedom to take risks. I don't know what to say, I admitted. You don't have to say anything. It's not a gift that requires gratitude. It's an inheritance being provided during my lifetime rather than after, with no strings attached. Use it to expand your business, to buy property, to travel the world, whatever would bring value to your life. I took a sip of wine, trying to absorb this latest development. Does Mom know about this? A shadow crossed his face. Yes, and it's been a point of contention. She believes it will encourage irresponsibility. I nodded, not surprised. And Alexander? Have you told him? Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first, since our relationship has been more strained. I'll be calling him next week. The conversation turned to other topics after that, but my mind kept returning to this unexpected development. It wasn't about the money itself, though that was certainly significant. It was about what it represented, my father's concrete acknowledgement that his previous approach had been wrong, his desire to provide practical support as well as emotional reconciliation. Sunday morning came too quickly, and with it the time for my father to return to Boston. As we stood at my door, his suitcase packed and waiting, there was an awkward moment where neither of us seemed to know how to say goodbye. Then, surprising, me once again, my father stepped forward and embraced me, not the formal, brief hug of family obligations, but a real embrace, warm and sincere. "Thank you for this weekend, Emma," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "For your openness, your willingness to begin again with me. It means more than I can express." I hugged him back, feeling the unfamiliar but welcome sense of being truly connected to my father. "Thank you for coming, for sharing everything with me." As he pulled away, he held my gaze. "This is just the beginning, if you're willing. I want to be part of your life in a real way, Emma. And I hope you'll want to be part of mine. This new chapter I'm starting." "I'd like that," I said, and meant it more deeply than I could have imagined possible a few days earlier. After he left, I wandered around my apartment, feeling as though some fundamental shift had occurred in the foundation of my life. The bitter resignation I had carried for years regarding my family, the acceptance that meaningful connection was unlikely, that approval would always be conditional, that my choices would never be truly understood, had begun to dissolve, replaced by a cautious but genuine hope. What I didn't yet realize was how this weekend would set in motion a cascade of changes, not just in my relationship with my father, but throughout the entire fabric of the Mitchell family. My mother's resistance to my father's evolution, Alexander and Olivia's return from their honeymoon to find family dynamics in flux, the reactions of the extended family to Richard Mitchell's unexpected retirement, and even more unexpected academic pursuits, all of this was yet to come. And none of us could have predicted the most shocking development of all, one that would force every member of our family to reevaluate who we were, both individually and collectively. Part 6. Family Earthquakes. The weeks following my father's visit to New York brought a flurry of communication, text messages, phone calls, even the occasional email with an article he thought might interest me or a question about my current projects. It was as if, having breached the wall of formality that had stood between us for so long, he was eager to explore the open territory on the other side. Alexander returned from his honeymoon and called me immediately after speaking with our father about his retirement plans and the trust funds. "Did you know about any of this?" he asked, his voice a mixture of confusion and excitement. "He told me when he visited New York," I confirmed. "It's a lot to take in, isn't it?" "That's an understatement. Dad retiring, going back to school for literature, setting up trust funds with no strings attached. It's like he's been replaced by a pod person." I laughed at the reference to one of our favorite sci-fi movies from childhood. It's definitely unexpected. But I think it's genuine, Alex. He seems lighter somehow, more himself than I've ever seen him. What about Mom? Have you spoken to her? Not yet, I admitted. My mother and I had exchanged brief text messages after the wedding, but nothing substantive. I'm not sure she'd welcome a call from me right now. Alexander sighed. She's not taking it well. Dad's changes, I mean. When Olivia and I had dinner with them last night, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mom barely spoke, and when she did, it was with this brittle politeness that was worse than open hostility. I could imagine it all too well. Catherine Mitchell's frozen smile, her carefully modulated voice, the subtle ways she could communicate disapproval without saying anything explicitly critical. Do you think they'll be okay? I asked, surprised by my own concern. Despite everything, the thought of my parents' marriage fracturing after nearly 40 years brought me no satisfaction. I don't know, Alexander said honestly. This is uncharted territory. Dad has never directly opposed Mom on something this important before. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that. Alexander and Olivia's honeymoon adventures, the house they were settling into, my latest design projects. But the undercurrent of concern about our parents remained, a subtle disquiet beneath the surface of our words. A month after my father's visit, I received a call from an unexpected source, my mother. Seeing her name on my phone screen was so surprising that I nearly declined the call reflexively. We spoke perhaps 3 or 4 times a year, usually brief, somewhat stilted conversations on holidays or birthdays. For her to call on a random Tuesday in August was unprecedented. "Hello, Mom," I answered cautiously. "Emma?" Her voice was its usual controlled self, though I detected a slight tension in it. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." "It's fine," I said. "Is everything okay?" There was a pause, then she spoke with apparent effort. "I wondered if you might be available for lunch next week. I'll be in New York for a charity event, and I thought perhaps we could meet." It was my turn to pause, trying to process this invitation. In all my years in New York, my mother had never suggested meeting just the two of us when she was in the city for her various social and philanthropic engagements. "Of course," I said finally. "I'd like that." We arranged to meet at an upscale restaurant near the charity venue the following Wednesday. After we hung up, I sat at my desk, staring at my phone and wondering what had prompted this unprecedented outreach. Was it related to my father's changes? Was she seeking an ally against his new direction? Or was it possible that she too was reconsidering our relationship? The week passed with a mixture of anticipation and dread. I found myself oddly nervous about seeing my mother one-on-one, something that hadn't happened in years. Our interactions were almost always in the context of family gatherings, with my father or Alexander or other relatives providing buffers between us. Wednesday arrived, and I dressed with particular care. A tailored navy dress that projected professional confidence while still being appropriately elegant for the restaurant she had chosen. I arrived early, wanting to be settled when she arrived rather than making an entrance under her critical gaze. My mother walked into the restaurant precisely on time, as was her habit. She was impeccably dressed as always, in a cream-colored skirt suit and pearls, her silver-streaked dark hair arranged in the same sophisticated style she had worn for decades. At 65, Catherine Mitchell remained a striking woman, with the kind of regal bearing that turned heads even in a city filled with beautiful people. She spotted me immediately and approached my table, her expression composed but unreadable. I stood to greet her, and we exchanged the briefest of embraces, a social formality rather than a genuine display of affection. "Emma," she said, taking her seat opposite me. "You look well. I'll continue this story for you." "Thank you, so do you, Mom." The waiter appeared to take our drink orders, sparkling water for my mother, white wine for me, and we occupied ourselves with studying the menus until he returned. It was a familiar pattern, this reliance on the rituals of dining to fill the space where comfortable conversation should be. Once we had ordered our meals and were alone again, my mother folded her hands on the table and regarded me directly. "I imagine you're wondering why I wanted to meet today." I nodded, taking a sip of my wine to buy time. The truth was, I'd been anxious about this lunch since she called 3 days ago. My mother wasn't one for casual get-togethers, especially not at upscale restaurants like this one, with its crisp white tablecloths and discreet service. Something was up. "I have some news," she continued, her fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around her water glass. "I've decided to sell the house." The house. Not my house or the family home, but simply the house, as though it were just any building rather than the sprawling Victorian where I'd grown up, where my father had died, where my mother had lived alone for the past 15 years. "Oh," I said inadequately. "When did you decide this?" "About 6 months ago. The paperwork was finalized yesterday." She took a sip of her water, her lipstick leaving a perfect coral crescent on the glass. "The new owners take possession at the end of the month." I felt a rush of something. Not quite anger, but close. Hurt, perhaps. 6 months? And you're just telling me now? She met my gaze evenly. "I didn't want to hear your objections until it was too late for them to matter." That was my mother. Brutally efficient, even in emotional matters. Especially in emotional matters. "I wasn't going to object," I lied. "It's your house." "It was our house," she corrected, surprising me. "Yours and mine and your father's. That's why I'm telling you now. There are things to sort through, decisions to make about what to keep and what to let go." The waiter arrived with bread, and we both fell silent. When he left, I broke a roll in half, watching the steam rise. "Where will you go?" "I've bought a condo downtown. 1 bedroom, just enough space for me. No yard to maintain, no stairs to climb as I get older." She paused. "It has a view of the river." I nodded, trying to imagine my elegant, reserved mother in a sleek downtown condo. It was difficult to picture, but then again, I realized I didn't know much about who she was now, 15 years after my father's death. We spoke monthly, met for holidays and occasional lunches like this one, but our conversations rarely went deeper than surface pleasantries. "There's something else," she said, and for the first time, I detected a note of uncertainty in her voice. She reached into her handbag and withdrew an envelope, placing it on the table between us. "This came about a week ago." I picked it up, noting the international postage and unfamiliar handwriting. The return address was in Barcelona, Spain. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, covered in a flowing script. "Dear Eleanor, after all these years, I hope this letter finds you well. Our mutual friend Maria Alvarez has informed me of Richard's passing, though I understand it has been some time now. Please accept my belated condolences. I will be visiting Boston next month and would very much like to see you, if you are amenable. There are matters I believe we should discuss in person. You can reach me at the number below. With fondest memories. Isabel Vega." I looked up, confused. Who's Isabel Vega? My mother's face was carefully composed, but I could see tension in the corners of her mouth. She was a friend. From before. Before what? Before everything. Before I met your father. Before America. She sighed. Isabel and I grew up together in Madrid. We were inseparable until I left Spain. This was news to me. My mother rarely spoke about her life in Spain before she immigrated to the United States in her early 20s. I knew the basics, that she'd come from Madrid, that her parents had died young, that she'd worked as a translator before meeting my father, but little else. You never mentioned her. No, I didn't. My mother took another sip of water. Our parting was difficult. The waiter arrived with our meals, salmon for her, pasta for me, and we both used the interruption to collect ourselves. As he walked away, I unfolded my napkin and placed it in my lap, buying time to process this. New information. Are you going to see her? I asked finally. I don't know. My mother pushed a piece of salmon around her plate. That's part of why I wanted to talk to you. The timing is strange, with the house sale. It feels like an ending and a beginning. All at once. She looked up at me. What would you do? The question startled me. My mother had never asked for my advice on personal matters before. Our relationship had always been clearly defined. She was the parent, the authority, the one who made decisions. I was the child, even now at 37. I paused, wanting to give her a real answer. I think I'd want to know why she's reaching out now after all this time. My mother nodded slowly. Yes, that's what I keep asking myself. She hesitated, then said, There's a box in the attic. Photos, letters, things from that time. I'd like you to come by this weekend to go through it with me. Of course, I said, surprised again. I can come Saturday? Saturday would be perfect. She smiled slightly. It's time you knew more about who I was before I became your mother. The rest of the lunch passed in a blur of conversation that felt more open than any we'd had in years. As we waited for the check, my mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly. Thank you, Eliza, she said, for understanding about the house and for agreeing to help with everything else. I squeezed back, feeling a rush of affection for this woman who had raised me but who, in many ways, remained a mystery. That's what daughters are for, right? Outside the restaurant, we parted with a promise to see each other Saturday. As I watched my mother walk to her car, back straight, head high, every movement controlled, I wondered about the young woman she had been in Spain, the friends she had left behind, and what secrets might be waiting in that box in the attic. Saturday morning arrived with a gentle drizzle that beaded on my windshield as I drove to my childhood home. The familiar streets of Newton seemed different somehow, knowing that soon my mother would no longer be part of this neighborhood. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, taking in the house. The 3-story Victorian with its wraparound porch and turret room had always seemed like something from a storybook to me. As a child, I'd imagined it was a castle. As a teenager, I'd found it embarrassingly ornate compared to my friends' modern homes. Now I simply saw it as beautiful and almost gone from our lives. My mother opened the door before I could knock, as though she'd been watching for me. She was dressed casually in slacks and a sweater, her silver hair pulled back in a simple knot. Come in, she said, stepping aside. I've made coffee. The house smelled the same as it always had, a mixture of lemon polish, old books, and the subtle floral scent of my mother's perfume. But there were changes. Some furniture was missing, and boxes were stacked in corners. You've already started packing, I observed, following her to the kitchen. Just the things I know I won't need. She poured coffee into 2 mugs, mine the same blue ceramic one I'd used as a teenager. The moving company comes next week for the furniture I'm taking. We sat at the kitchen table, a heavy antique thing that had been the center of family meals for decades. I ran my hand over the familiar scratches and water rings that told our history. Is this coming with you? I asked. My mother shook her head. No room in the condo. I thought perhaps you might want it. I looked up, surprised. Really? Unless you don't have space in your apartment. No, I do. I'd love to have it. I smiled, oddly moved by the offer. Thank you. She nodded, then stood. Shall we go up to the attic? The box I mentioned is up there. I followed her up 2 flights of stairs, then up the narrow attic staircase. The attic had always been my favorite place as a child, cool and mysterious, filled with trunks and old furniture draped in sheets. Now it was mostly empty, the contents presumably sorted and either packed or discarded. My mother moved to a corner where a single cardboard box sat on the floor. It looked ordinary, unmarked except for the word Madrid written in black marker. "Here it is," she said, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside it. The casual posture was so unlike her that I stared for a moment before joining her. She opened the box carefully. On top was a small bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. "These were from Isabel," she said, running her fingers over the top envelope. "We wrote to each other for about a year after I came to America. Before—" She trailed off, then set the bundle aside without opening any of the letters. Beneath them was a photo album bound in cracked leather. My mother opened it, and I leaned closer to see black and white photographs carefully mounted on black paper. "This is Isabel and me," she said, pointing to a photograph of two young women sitting on the edge of a fountain. They were both laughing, arms linked, dark hair blowing in what must have been a strong breeze. I studied the one my mother had identified as herself. Slim, vivacious, with a wide smile I'd rarely seen in person. "You look happy," I said softly. I was. She turned the page. More photos of the two young women, at a cafe, on a beach, dressed up for what looked like a formal dance. In every image, they were together, often touching, hands clasped, arms around waists, heads leaning together. "You were very close," I observed. My mother was quiet for a long moment. "Yes, we were very close." Something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. She was staring at the photographs with an expression I couldn't quite read. Nostalgia, certainly, but also something deeper. Regret, perhaps. Or longing. Suddenly, I understood. "You and Isabel," I said carefully. "You were more than friends. Weren't you?" My mother's hand stilled on the page. She didn't look up, but I saw her swallow hard before she spoke. "Yes." The word was barely audible. "We were in love." The admission hung in the air between us. I felt a swell of emotions, surprise, confusion, a strange sense of revelation, as though pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving suddenly fit together. "What happened?" I asked gently. My mother closed the album and rested her hands on the cover. "My father found out. He was traditional, conservative. He gave me an ultimatum: end things with Isabel or be disowned." She shook her head. "I was young, scared. I chose to leave Spain, to come to America where a cousin of my mother's lived." "Did you tell Isabel why you were leaving?" "Not the whole truth. I told her I needed to make my own way, that America offered opportunities I couldn't find in Spain." She sighed. "It was cowardly. I wrote to her for a while, but eventually stopped responding to her letters. It was too painful, and I thought it would be easier for both of us to make a clean break." I thought about the letter that had arrived, after all these years. "And now she wants to see you." "Yes." My mother finally looked up at me. "What must she think of me, Eliza? What kind of person abandons someone they love without a proper explanation? Without a proper goodbye?" "A young, frightened person," I said, reaching for her hand. "Mom, you were what, 20? 21. You did what you thought you had to do, and now you have a chance to explain if you want to." She squeezed my hand. "What if she hates me? What if she's only coming to tell me what a terrible person I am?" "Then you'll listen and apologize, and at least you'll know." I paused, but her letter didn't sound angry. "Fondest memories," she wrote. My mother nodded slowly. "I've thought about her so often over the years, especially after your father died." She gave me a searching look. "Does it bother you, learning this about me? That you loved a woman?" I shook my head. "No, Mom. I'm just sad that you felt you had to hide that part of yourself for so long." She looked relieved, then thoughtful. I did love your father. You know, very much. That wasn't pretend. I know, I said, and I did. Whatever else was complicated about my mother's life, her devotion to my father had been real and deep. Being bisexual wasn't something people talked about openly then, she continued. It was easier to just put that part of myself away. The term sounded strange coming from my proper, reserved mother, and I realized this must be something she'd thought about privately for years, without ever having the opportunity to discuss it. Have there been other women since Dad died? I asked, then quickly added, You don't have to answer that if it's too personal. She smiled slightly. No, there haven't been. No men either, for that matter. After your father, I simply didn't want anyone else. She paused. But seeing Isabel's name again, after all these years, it stirred something. A wondering about paths not taken. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her revelations settling around us. Then she reached back into the box and pulled out a small velvet pouch. There's one more thing I wanted to show you, she said, loosening the drawstring. She tipped a silver pendant into her palm, an intricately designed tree with spreading branches. Isabel gave me this the night before I left. It's a tree of life, she said. My mother's voice caught. She said no matter how far apart we were, we'd always be connected, like roots of the same tree. I gently touched the pendant. It's beautiful. I've kept it all these years but never wore it. It felt like a betrayal somehow of the choice I'd made. She closed her fingers around it. I think I'll wear it when I see her. So, you've decided to meet with her? My mother nodded. Yes. It's time to face the past, don't you think? Before I move into this new chapter of my life. I smiled. I think that's very brave. She laughed softly. Brave? At my age? I suppose it's never too late to find courage. We spent the rest of the afternoon going through the box together. There were more photographs, ticket stubs from concerts and plays, a pressed flower from what my mother said was the Royal Botanical Garden in Madrid, and a small sketch of the two young women that Isabel had drawn. With each item, my mother shared stories I'd never heard before, about the music they'd loved, the books they'd argued over, the dreams they'd had for their futures. I began to see her as she had been then, passionate, impulsive, full of hope and ambition. You wanted to be a writer, I said, surprised when she mentioned it. I did. Poetry, specifically. She smiled ruefully. I wasn't very good, but Isabel always encouraged me. She was studying art, and she believed creativity was valuable for its own sake, not just for the results. What happened to that dream? Life happened. Coming to America, learning to navigate a new country, meeting your father, having you. She touched my cheek briefly. I don't regret the choices I made, Eliza. But sometimes I wonder about the woman I might have become if I'd stayed in Spain, if I'd been braver. As the afternoon light began to fade, we carefully returned everything to the box except for the pendant, which my mother slipped into her pocket. We made our way back downstairs to the kitchen, where she prepared a simple dinner for us. Over the meal, I asked, Would you like me to come with you? When you meet Isabel? She considered this. No. I think this is something I need to do alone. But afterward, perhaps you could meet her then. I'd like that, I said, and realized it was true. I wanted to meet this woman who had been my mother's first love, who still mattered enough for her to keep a box of memories for over 40 years. After dinner, as I prepared to leave, my mother walked me to the door. Thank you for today, she said, for listening, for understanding. Thank you for trusting me with your story, I replied. Will you let me know how the meeting goes? Of course. She hesitated, then added, Eliza, I've been thinking. After I meet with Isabel after the move, I'd like us to spend more time together. Really get to know each other as the people we are now. I felt a surge of emotion. I'd like that too, Mom. We hugged, holding on a bit longer than usual, before I stepped out into the evening. As I drove away, I glanced back to see my mother, standing on the porch of the house that would soon belong to someone else, her silhouette framed by the warm light behind her. She looked smaller somehow, but also lighter, as though relieving herself of secrets had physically unburdened her. I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I was genuinely curious about what would happen next between my mother and me. About the relationship we might build now that she was allowing me to see her as a whole person, with a past and desires and regrets of her own. It felt like the beginning of something new, even as we prepared to say goodbye to the house that had sheltered our family for so long. 3 weeks later, I received a text from my mother. Isabel is coming for tea tomorrow at 3. Would you join us at 4? I stared at the message, my heart beating faster. So they had met already, and it had gone well enough that Isabel was coming to my mother's new condo. Well enough that my mother wanted me to meet her. I texted back, I'll be there, at 4, looking forward to it. The next day, I found myself standing outside my mother's new building, a sleek glass and steel structure overlooking the Charles River. It was as different from our family Victorian as could be imagined. Modern, minimalist, urban. I took the elevator to the 11th floor and found my mother's door. When she opened, I was struck by how different she looked. She was wearing a stylish blue dress I'd never seen before. Her hair was styled more softly around her face, and around her neck was the silver tree of life pendant. But it wasn't just her appearance. There was something in her bearing, in her expression, a kind of quiet radiance that made her seem younger, more vibrant. Come in, she said, kissing my cheek. Isabel is here. I followed her into the living room of the condo, which was sparsely but elegantly furnished. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of the river and the Boston skyline beyond. Standing by those windows was a slender woman with silver-streaked dark hair cut in a sophisticated bob. She turned as we entered, and I saw a face. That was still beautiful, with high cheekbones and expressive dark eyes that crinkled warmly as she smiled. You must be Eliza, she said, stepping forward with her hand extended. Her accent was pronounced, but her English was perfect. I have heard so much about you. It's wonderful to meet you, I said, taking her hand. It was warm and her grip was firm. I've heard quite a bit about you too, though only recently. Isabel's eyes flickered to my mother, a look passing between them that I couldn't quite interpret. Please, sit, my mother said, gesturing to the seating area where a tea service was arranged on a low table. I'll pour. We settled ourselves, Isabel and I on the sofa, my mother in an armchair adjacent. As she prepared the tea with practiced movements, I studied Isabel more carefully. In her mid-60s, she carried herself with a natural elegance that reminded me of my mother. She wore simple but clearly expensive clothing, black pants, a white silk blouse, a single strand of pearls. Artist's hands, I noticed, with slender fingers and a small callus on her right middle finger where a pencil might rest. Your mother tells me you work in publishing, Isabel said as my mother handed her a cup of tea. Yes, I'm an editor at Houghton Mifflin, I replied. I work primarily with literary fiction. Ah, so you have her love of literature, Isabel smiled. She was always reading when we were young. Poetry, novels, philosophy, anything she could get her hands on. She mentioned that recently, I said, accepting my own cup from my mother. She also told me you were an artist. I still am, Isabel said. I teach at the university now, but I maintain a studio and exhibit occasionally. My mother settled back in her chair. Isabel has brought some of her work to show us. It's in that portfolio, She nodded toward a large leather case leaning against the wall. I'd love to see it, I said. Isabel rose and retrieved the portfolio, bringing it back to the coffee table. These are recent works, she said, opening it to reveal vivid, abstract paintings that seemed to capture light and movement in bold strokes. We spent the next half hour looking through Isabel's art while she explained her techniques and influences. I was genuinely impressed. Her work was powerful and confident, showing a masterful use of color and composition. As Isabel was describing a particular piece, I glanced at my mother and found her watching Isabel with undisguised admiration and something else, a tenderness that made me feel suddenly like an intruder. These are extraordinary, I said, closing the portfolio. Thank you for sharing them. Isabel smiled. Eleanor tells me you've been helping her sort through things from the old house. Yes, I said, looking to my mother for guidance on how much to say. She gave me a small nod. It's been illuminating. I've learned a lot about her life before America. Ah, Isabel said softly. That is good. Parents should not be mysteries to their children. She paused. Though perhaps some mystery is inevitable, no? I think so, I agreed. No matter how close we are to our parents, there are parts of their lives we never see, experiences we can't share. Exactly so. Isabel set down her teacup. Eleanor has told me that you know about what we were to each other when we were young. I nodded, aware of my mother tensing slightly in her chair. And this does not trouble you? Isabel asked directly. Not at all, I said. I'm just glad to know more about my mother's life, to understand her better. Isabel looked pleased. You have raised a compassionate daughter, Eleanor. My mother smiled, visibly relaxing. I can take only partial credit. Eliza has always had a generous heart. There was a moment of comfortable silence. Then Isabel said, Perhaps Eleanor has told you that I am widowed now. My husband, Miguel, passed 3 years ago. I'm sorry for your loss, I said automatically, though I was surprised. I hadn't known Isabel had been married. Thank you, he was a good man. We had many happy years together, and 2 sons who now have children of their own. She looked at my mother. Life takes us on unexpected paths, does it not? It does, my mother agreed. Rarely where we think we're going when we're young. Isabel reached across the space between them and took my mother's hand. The gesture was brief but intimate, and I saw my mother's fingers curl around hers before they both let go. I should check on the pastries, my mother said, standing. Eliza, would you help me in the kitchen? I followed her to the small modern kitchen, where a plate of pastries was already arranged on the counter. Everything okay? I asked quietly. My mother busied herself with rearranging the pastries. Yes. I just wanted a moment. She glanced at me. What do you think of her? I like her very much, I said honestly. She's impressive, and she clearly cares about you. My mother nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. Our first meeting was intense. We talked for hours. There were tears, explanations, apologies. She paused. It's strange, Eliza. In some ways, it feels like no time has passed at all. In others, it's so clear that we're different people now than we were then. Different, but still connected, I suggested. Yes. She touched the pendant at her throat. Still connected. I hesitated, then asked, Will you see each other again, after she returns to Spain? My mother picked up the plate of pastries. Actually, Isabel has extended her stay. She'll be in Boston for another month. She didn't meet my eyes. We're exploring what might be possible, given our current lives. I felt a rush of happiness for her. Mom, that's wonderful. She looked up, her expression vulnerable in a way I'd rarely seen. Is it? At our age? At any age, I said firmly. Life doesn't stop offering possibilities just because we get older. She smiled fully then, and I was struck again by how transformed. She seemed more vibrant, more present, as though parts of her that had been dormant were awakening. "We should get back," she said. But before we left the kitchen, she paused. "Thank you, Eliza, for understanding, for being happy for me." "Always," I said, and I meant it. When we returned to the living room, I saw Isabel standing by the windows again, silhouetted against the afternoon light. She turned as we entered, and the smile she gave my mother was so full of warmth and possibility that I felt my own eyes sting with unexpected tears. In that moment, watching these two women who had found each other again after so many years, I thought about the strange, winding paths our lives take, the choices we make that lead us away from some futures and toward others, the chances for redemption and renewal that arrive when we least expect them. And I thought about my own life, the paths I had taken and those I had avoided, the possibilities that might still be waiting, undiscovered, if only I had the courage to reach for them. As my mother set the pastries on the table and Isabel moved to join her, their hands brushed. A small touch, casual and brief. But in it, I saw decades of history, of longing, of what might have been transformed, miraculously, into what still could be. The future, I realized watching them, is never quite as fixed as we believe it to be. Even after a lifetime of choices, new doors can open. New beginnings can emerge from old endings. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, what we thought was lost forever can find its way back to us, changed by time, but still recognizable, still precious. 6 months later, I helped my mother pack for a trip to Spain. She was going to stay with Isabel for 3 weeks, to meet her sons and grandchildren, to see the Madrid of today and revisit the places they had known in their youth. "Are you nervous?" I asked, folding a sweater and placing it in her suitcase. "Terrified," she admitted with a laugh. "What if her family doesn't like me? What if Madrid has changed so much I don't recognize it? What if it's wonderful?" I interrupted gently. "What if this is exactly what you both need?" She smiled, shaking her head. "When did you become the wise one?" "I learned from the best," I said, handing her the travel documents I'd helped organize. My mother had been like a different person these past months. She and Isabel had spent nearly every day together during Isabel's extended stay in Boston, and even after Isabel returned to Spain, they spoke daily. My mother laughed more, took risks with her clothing and her opinions, shared stories and feelings more freely than she ever had before. She had also, to my surprise, started writing poetry again. Nothing worth publishing, she insisted, but the joy it gave her was evident. Now, as we finished her packing, she sat on the edge of her bed and patted the space beside her. When I sat down, she took my hand. "I've been thinking a lot about courage," she said. "Not the dramatic kind, but the everyday sort. The courage to be honest, to be vulnerable, to try again after failure." I nodded, waiting. If Isabel hadn't found that courage to write to me after all these years, my life would be very different now. She squeezed my hand. "I want you to know that it's never too late to change your story, Eliza. Never too late to find happiness, even if it comes in unexpected forms." "I know, Mom," I said, though in truth, I wasn't sure I fully believed it. My own life felt settled, if somewhat lonely. At 37, I had a career I loved, but a personal life that was, at best, stagnant. I hadn't had a serious relationship in years. My mother, always perceptive, seemed to read my thoughts. "When I was your age, I thought my life was set in stone. I had you, I had your father, I had our home and my work. I couldn't imagine anything changing." She smiled ruefully. I was wrong. Life kept happening, whether I was ready for it or not. "And now?" I asked. "Now I know that every day is a new opportunity to choose differently, to be braver, to be more fully myself." She touched the Tree of Life pendant that she now wore every day. That's the gift Isabel has given me, even more than her love, the permission to reinvent myself at 65. I hugged her then, this woman who had raised me, who had hidden so much of herself for so long, and who was now showing me what it meant to embrace life with both hands, regardless of age or circumstances. The next morning, I drove her to the airport. As we said goodbye at the security checkpoint, she hugged me tightly. "I'll call when I land," she promised. "Have a wonderful time," I said. "Give my best to Isabel." She stepped back, studying my face. "When I get back, I want to hear about what new paths you're exploring, Eliza. What adventures you're allowing yourself." I smiled, a bit uncomfortably. "I'll see what I can come up with." "Don't do it for me," she said firmly. "Do it for yourself. Life is too short to live cautiously all the time." With that, she turned and walked toward security, her back straight, her step confident. I watched until she disappeared from view, her words echoing in my mind. Driving home, I thought about what it would mean to live less cautiously, to open myself to new possibilities. It was easier said than done, after years of building routines and protective walls. But as I parked outside my apartment building, I made a decision. If my mother could reinvent herself at 65, I could at least try to be braver at 37. I took out my phone and found the business card I'd been carrying for weeks, given to me by a charming bookstore owner I'd met at a publishing event, who'd invited me to a literary salon he hosted monthly. "It's for people who love books too. Much for their own good," he'd said, his eyes crinkling with humor. Smart, opinionated people who aren't afraid to argue about Oxford commas and the merits of first-person narrators. I'd taken the card, flattered and intrigued, but hadn't followed up. It felt too much like putting myself out there, too much like risking rejection or disappointment. Now, sitting in my car, I typed out a message asking if the invitation was still open. Before I could reconsider, I pressed send. The response came almost immediately. "Absolutely. We meet this Thursday at 7. Would love to see you there." I smiled, feeling a flutter of anticipation. It was a small step, but a step nonetheless. A choice to be a little braver, a little more open to what life might offer. As I got out of my car, I looked up at the clear October sky and thought about my mother, flying toward a reunion with her first love, toward a past that was somehow becoming part of her future. I thought about Isabel, who had found the courage to reach out across decades of silence, and I thought about myself, standing at the beginning of a path I couldn't yet see clearly, but was finally ready to explore. The future, like the past, would be full of unexpected turns, of doors closing and others opening, of chances taken and missed, of connections lost and found. But for now, for today, it was enough to know that the story wasn't over. Not my mother's, not mine. That as long as we were breathing, there were still pages to be written, still possibilities waiting to be discovered. That it was never too late to find the courage to begin.